My name is John Hare. I'm the CEO of ImmuniMed Inc., a Winnipeg-based clinical stage biopharmaceutical company with a phase 2 clinical trial right now ongoing to treat C. difficile infection. And so the first thing we're going to do is talk about C. difficile infection and what it is. The problem, C. difficile infection, C. diff, or Clostridioides difficile, is a superbug, and it's often shortened to C. difficile or just C. diff. It's a gram-positive spore-forming bacteria that in North America infects 500,000 people every year and kills about 30,000. So that's between 3 and 6% of people who get C. diff end up dying from it, which is a pretty high number. Anyway, so the present standard of care for treating C. difficile is an antibiotic treatment because it's a bacteria. Typically for bacteria you treat with an antibiotic. The ones that are approved by the FDA right now are metronidazole, vancomycin, and fidaxomicin. And when we started the ImmuniMed back in 2012, the standard of care that was being prescribed to patients that had C. difficile was metronidazole. About 3 or 4 years after that, we saw, and as a matter of fact, it was an official announcement basically by the infectious disease doctors in Winnipeg, which I think was coordinated with infectious disease doctors around the world. They were going to switch to vancomycin because they weren't seeing the effects with metronidazole anymore. Anyway, and so as of late, even in the last 6 months or so, we're seeing patients now being prescribed fidaxomicin. That's a newer and more expensive drug. And as it goes, metronidazole relatively inexpensive, not very effective. Vancomycin more expensive, probably $1,800 a dose in the U.S., and fidaxomicin even more, $5,600 U.S. to treat for a 10 to 15 day course. Anyway, so the problem with antibiotics is side effects, and you've probably taken antibiotics yourself, and you might have seen some of those side effects, and then resistance is another issue with antibiotics. And when I say resistance, that's basically what we were talking about. That's why they're moving from metronidazole to vancomycin to fidaxomicin, because the bacteria are mutating to the point where these older antibiotics aren't working as well. So that's what resistance is, and that's what it's called a superbug, because the typical antibiotics, normally all antibiotics will work against an bacteria. So now there's really only 3 that seem to be. But anyway, so that's the resistance issue. And the other thing with C. difficile, because C. diff is a spore-forming bacteria, you get what they call recurrence. And so the antibiotic, all of them, they're targeted to knock out the actual bacteria. But what they mean by a spore-forming bacteria is that bacteria is a bacteria by itself, but it also gives off a spore or multiple spores. And so those spores can lay dormant. So you get treated with one of these antibiotics for C. difficile infection. You take the treatment for the 10 to 14 days and you get better, or at least you think you're better. 2 weeks down the road, you're feeling pretty good. All of a sudden, bang, you're hit with another dose of the infection, which basically means that one of those spores has germinated and now caused you to be infected again. And this happens, in other words, the antibiotics now, vancomycin, fidaxomicin, are working with no recurrence probably between 60 and 75% of the time. In other words, between 25 and 40% of the time, the patients that are being given these standard of care antibiotic treatments are getting recurrent infections. And we've seen recurrent infections with people, up to 7 recurrent infections in a row, and even more than that. Some people are suffering with C. diff recurrent infections for 3 and 4 years. And the worst part of it is, the more you get infected, the more chances are you're not going to survive it. Anyway, so the question is, why are we doing this discussion right now? Well, there's a prize, and it's $2 billion a year. That's what the treatment value for treating C. difficile is. And so that's why a bunch of companies are trying to come up with something to meet what they call an unmet medical need. Unmet medical need means the treatment right now that they have doesn't work 100%. And so you're getting 30,000 deaths every year in North America. As a result, unmet medical need means that $2 billion prize is up for grabs. It also means that you've got patients that are dying and not surviving, and that's one of the things we want to take care of. So anyway, there's 2 ways to look at a solution. And so the the thing that antimicrobial resistance, one of the things that's going on right now is people are talking about AMR, antimicrobial resistance, being the next pandemic, and they're predicting by 2050 that over 10 million people a year will die around the world from a simple infection like a cut on your finger, because there's no antibiotics left to treat them. So, and unfortunately, pharma companies aren't really investing in new antibiotics. So in our case, we've come up with something which is oral dose antibodies, which we feel is better anyway. But let's get back to the treatments themselves. So what would obviously be better would be a new antibiotic that worked all the time, which doesn't seem to be the case, and nothing's coming up so far. But something better as a standard of care would be great. Alternatively, what they're doing is most of the companies that are trying to compete or trying to get in on this market are coming up with something to make the present standard of care, these 3 antibiotics, work better. In other words, so that they don't get the recurrence that they've been getting. Anyway, and so the competition that's available for that, and the first one that was approved by FDA is a product from Merck. Merck's the big multinational pharma company. Came up with a monoclonal antibody, and I don't know if you're familiar with monoclonal antibodies, but they're the biggest drugs now being produced by pharma, and they're very, very expensive. Matter of fact, I think they say the average drug price to treat a patient, and most of the monoclonals are being used for oncology and cancer treatments, and that are $115,000 per year per patient. So very expensive treatments. Zimplava is a monoclonal antibody produced by Merck. They originally thought that they could get it to work as a standard of care. In other words, give people that monoclonal, and it would eliminate the bacteria and the spores better than the standard of care antibiotics. Didn't work out that way, and so what they did is they went back to the next thing. Let's see if we can't generate something from this by using it as an add-on. And so now it is approved by FDA as an add-on to the standards of care. Unfortunately, it's $4,000 for the treatment. It's an IV, so you've got to go into a doctor's office and get that IV for an hour. And it doesn't reduce the recurrence by very much, and that's been the problem. So anyway, there's been another thing that's been around for probably 10 to 15 years, and it's kind of an off the grid treatment as a matter of fact, one of the pioneers was a gastroenterologist out of Australia. Then it's called fecal microbiota transplant, or FMT. And what that is basically taking the stool of a healthy patient and getting it into the bowel of the C. diff patient, and it's worked relatively well. But the problem with FMT just by itself is it's very unregulated, and the FDA doesn't really they've sort of turned a blind eye to it and let it be done for C. diff alone, because people weren't getting better with the standard of care, and so they had to have something. They'd shown that they were getting about 90% success in reducing recurrence by using this FMT. Anyway, so extending on that, now there's been a few companies that have raised huge amounts of money that have said, okay, we need something that the FDA is going to approve so that basically it can be then put through the insurance situations like Medicare and that kind of thing. And so these companies raised, as a matter of fact, we call them FMT variants. There's a company called Cirrus Therapeutics, another one called Rebiotics, and another one called Vedanta. And there are 3 companies that are trying to take advantage of that FMT technology, which is basically poop and put it into a pill. And so Cirrus has been recently approved, and their Voust capsules are basically, I sort of make the joke, it's called crapsules, but anyway, they've got virtually the something from stool put into a pill that you can take. The treatment is a 3-day treatment, $17,500 US. Pretty expensive, and that's an add-on treatment. And so in other words, they're here trying to make the present standard of care better. In other words, you take the antibiotic treatment, be it right now vancomycin or fidaxomicin, spend that much money on it to begin with, and then if you've multiple recurrent, you're going to say, well, I can't stand this anymore. I'll spend the $17,500 just to reduce my chances of being reinfected again with that spore germinating. So pretty expensive. Rebiotics is also, they're not, they are approved, and that's Rebiotics was bought out, I think, they're a Minnesota company bought out by a company in Switzerland. Ferring is a microbiome type of company $2.4 billion company. They bought Rebiotics in about 2018. They've got an approved treatment, which is actually an enema. So in other words, that you have to go in. It's a treatment where it's sort of like a fecal matter transplant, but you're just doing a little enema, and that charges $9,500 per treatment. So, and then the last one is Vedanta, which is working right now, and they're in phase 3 right now, and they're also a capsule. And these companies, okay, so we don't know about Rebiotics Ferrin because they were bought out, and Ferrin is a large drug company anyway. But Sears has raised $512 million to do their clinical trials. Vedanta has raised $433 million, and that's over the last 8 to 10 years. And so obviously investors are, and the industry itself is suggesting there's a lot to be gained, and that's the price, the $2 billion a year. That's what they're working on. Unfortunately, these guys can only treat multiple recurrent. In other words, they're an add-on to the present standard of care. So if only 25 to 40% of the people who take those antibiotics get recurrent C. diff, that means that's their market. Mind you, they're charging a lot of money for that market, and so I guess they think, well, out of the 500,000 people that get sick, 25 to 40% of those at $17,500 per treatment, that's pretty good return. Anyway, now the alternative is something better than the standard of care. And nobody has been thinking of that. In other words, everybody just thinks naturally, bacteria, antibiotic. And there are actually a couple of new antibiotics being developed that potentially might work better than the fidaxomicin. I'm going to say they're going to be a way more money than fidaxomicin because obviously a lot of investment's got to go in to make it better than that. And so whether or not that comes out as better or not, we'll see. But in the meantime, there's a company called ImmuniMed, which I introduced myself as the CEO already. And we're the first in the world, oral dose antibodies. And you're familiar with the word antibodies. Actually, COVID, terrible thing that happened, but one thing it did, everybody now knows about the word antibodies. You typically think of antibodies being developed either naturally when you got COVID, for example, your immune system would put out antibodies which would get you better from COVID, or you'd get the vaccine, which theoretically was supposed to trick your immune system to produce antibodies that would then prevent you from getting sick with COVID. Anyway, that's typically what vaccines do, but anyway, you know what antibodies are. In our case, we use the immune system of an outside source. We don't use your immune system. We actually get the antibodies from laying hens, and that's how it works. We do a vaccine protocol with them, and we develop their immune system to produce what we want. We harvest the eggs, and that's actually the treatment that you get for C. difficile from us. And we're the world's first oral dose antibodies to ever be used. As a matter of fact, a milestone we actually developed back in 2007, late 2007, the world's first veterinary biologic, which is an animal health treatment, registered to treat baby pigs for E. coli problems. And so that was our very first one. And now we're going to be, with this one, we'll be the world's first human oral dose antibody treatment, and it's going to be to treat C. difficile infection. Right now, we're in what's called a phase 2 clinical trial. Clinical trials typically go phase 1, phase 2, phase 3. Phase 1 is safety, phase 2 is efficacy and safety, phase 3 is just more patients. And matter of fact, because we're an unmet medical need, a lot of times in phase 3 the FDA will allow you to actually commercialize the trial. In other words, you could actually charge patients for treating them. Anyway, but what we really have is, before we did this, we obviously did animal trials where, funny enough, my background is animal agriculture, and baby pigs, if you can believe it, get C. difficile infection. So one of the things we did is when we had our actual antibodies, we tried it in a couple of pig barns we knew down in Minnesota that had incidences of C. diff for the baby pigs, and we solved those problems. So that gave us some confidence that we were onto something that looked like it was going to work. Anyway, but then we got into the human side, and we actually teamed up with a bunch of clinicians who were primarily people, and this is quite a while back, and even the FMT, the fecal microbiota transplant, was relatively new, but we teamed up with a few of those patients that weren't even getting the results with the FMT, and we got in total about 106 patients to go through our trial, and it was we recorded all the results of the trial, but it wasn't an official FDA or Health Canada approved trial, and but they call it compassionate grounds because these patients weren't getting better otherwise, and so the clinicians were allowed to do alternative treatments, and that's what this was. And we got, again, 94% success. And that's by way better than anything else we've seen anywhere on this board as far as other alternative treatments. And the other thing about that is, now when I say something better as standard of care, well, all these other companies are working down here with something to make the present standard of care better. If you can come up with something better as the standard of care, which we can do and we are doing, all of these things go by the wayside. I mean, why would you even need to take something that makes the standard of care better when the standard of care is better than these treatments anyway? So you can see the money that these companies have raised, and obviously Merck didn't need to raise money. They're a huge multinational company to begin with. But these guys raising virtually $1 billion between two companies to just do an add-on to the standard of care, which isn't working very well. And we're very confident we can do this, we'll be able to take over the standard of care. All of a sudden, now that $2 billion prize goes to one player, and there's nobody else coming up with something better. Personally, I've seen it. I've been out. The very first patient we had in Manitoba, I found that patient through a friend of mine. It was, at a hospital, if you can believe it, in St. Anne, Manitoba, all of 17 beds in that hospital, and we got a patient there, and I was there for the actual treatment of that patient on the very first, go around, and she got better within the prescribed time, and that was great. And so we're off to pretty good, and that was long after, obviously, having all these results. And so it's nice to see that we've had these kind of results. We know we're going to continue getting it. Our biggest problem of late, unfortunately, we got approval, which isn't really approval. They give you the Health Canada after we do all our application, which probably took us 4 years. They don't give you approval to go out and recruit patients. They give you a letter of no objection, which is an interesting way, I guess, of maybe, we never approved it. We just couldn't find any reason to object to you recruiting patients. And we got that back in 2019 late, and what happened shortly thereafter was COVID. Obviously, we couldn't even get near a hospital to recruit patients, but we've been stumbling through, and now we've gotten about half the trial done, and we're still batting about 94% success, which is, like I said, in a drug treatment, that's very, very good. Anyway, so the other thing that's interesting, we're a Winnipeg-based Canadian company, biopharmaceutical company, clinical stage biopharmaceutical, targeting a major, I would call it, superbug, resulting in potentially a blockbuster result. And that's really what we're doing. We've been, kept our costs as low as possible, to the point where we've gotten to this stage. And most people I talk to in the industry, and I go down to different conferences with competitive companies, why are you here? They would sort of, well, we're in a phase 2 clinical trial right now for C. diff. And they sort of look at me like, well, who's backing you? Well, we've found it. We've been, able to get local investors to a certain degree, to the point where that's helped us a lot. By the way, we've got the Manitoba government, which is from a Manitoba, they call it the Manitoba Small Business Venture Capital Tax Credit Program, which is a tax credit benefit to Manitoba taxpayers that would invest with us. So anyway, we've been able to keep going, but we're obviously need more as we go along. And the nice thing about it, the prize is pretty amazing. And so these companies, matter of fact, Cirrus is a publicly traded company, and they're doing nothing but the add-on treatment. Their market cap right now, and all they've got is that treatment that they're selling at $17,500 per treatment. They don't have any other pipeline drugs that are actually even close to being it's working, and they're now at a market cap of $500 million. And so obviously that's where it can go. As a matter of fact, during their time, they were public virtually from the beginning, they've been as high as $3 billion, because people look at the potential of what you can get out of this. And so the annual market should be about $2 billion a year to treat C. difficile, especially as the standard of care, which we really believe we can replace. And by the way, as an alternative to an antibiotic, everybody would go that route. And the nice thing about it, the actual treatment itself, every drug that you talk about has side effects. In our trial, the one thing that restricts a patient from being allowed in the trial is if they have an egg allergy, which going forward, if we get approval, as we expect we will, egg allergy is pretty minor by comparison to C. difficile. As a final part of our discussion, if somebody is going to invest in anything, they want to know the people they're investing with. And so, you've been listening to me talk this much for this long. And my name is John Hare. My background is I'm animal agriculture, Bachelor of Science in Agriculture, Master of Business Administration. I'm the business side. The good news is, and I'm not going to take anything away from my own situation, but my partner is Dr. Pradeep Methi. Dr. Methi has a PhD in immunology microbiology. He has a vast background in monoclonal antibodies, worked for 12 years for a company called Novapharm, where he developed monoclonal antibodies to treat breast cancer, has a great knowledge of immunotherapy. And so we've been really fortunate, I've been fortunate to have him as a partner to really lead the scientific side of this whole thing. And in closing, we've got some very good people working with us. We've got great lab techs making the vaccine that we need. All we need now is some financing to make things go forward faster, and your help would be much appreciated. One thing I need to mention is, if you're a Manitoba taxpayer, there is a 45% tax credit of anything you invest that helps defer the risk that you might otherwise think you have. Personally, I'm not looking at risk on the downside. I'm looking at the potential on the upside, and where we're bringing it in as your upside potential is between 10 and 50 times what the investment would be. So that's the nice thing about a biotech. It takes a long time to develop, 10 to 15 years they say sometimes, and it has taken us a while so far, but once you hit it, it's typically very big, and that's where we're at. It'd be a great accomplishment for our company ImmuniMed, for the people who work with us. I think a great accomplishment for Winnipeg and Manitoba and Canada for that matter, because we really don't have the biotech expertise. This will be a great way to start. With your help, maybe we can make it happen.